What is the worst way to die? It is a question humanity has morbidly pondered for millennia. Is it the swift finality of the blade? The purifying agony of the flame? The suffocating darkness of being buried alive? We, as a species, have engineered a truly staggering variety of ways to end a life. But most methods, however brutal, are finite. They have a beginning and an end. They are a process of destruction. But what if a method of execution was devised that was not about destruction, but about cultivation? A method that did not seek to simply end a life, but to transform the living body into a thriving ecosystem of its own decay? A punishment designed not to kill you, but to make you the unwilling host, the living vessel for a slow, agonizing, and meticulously managed putrefaction. In the annals of human cruelty, a subject with no shortage of terrifying entries, one punishment stands alone in its diabolical ingenuity. It comes to us from the heart of the ancient Persian Empire, a civilization known for its grandeur and sophistication. But beneath the veneer of imperial glory lay a capacity for a horror so profound it remains shocking to this day. They called it Scaphism, the boats. And it wasn't just a way to die. It was a sentence to become a living feast, to be consumed, piece by piece, by the smallest and most relentless of nature's executioners. This is the story of how an empire turned a man's own body into his tomb, and his sweet nourishment into the very instrument of his damnation. Our story begins in the 5th century BC, within the sprawling Achaemenid Persian Empire, under the rule of King Artaxerxes II. The Persian Empire was, at the time, the largest the world had ever known, a superpower of immense wealth and military might. To challenge the king of kings, was not merely treason. It was an act of cosmic arrogance, and it demanded a punishment that was equally grand in its cruelty. Our main source for this terrifying practice comes from the Greek historian and biographer Plutarch in his work, The Life of Artaxerxes. Now, we must add a crucial caveat here. Plutarch was a Greek writing about the Persians, their historical rivals. The Greeks often portrayed the Persians as decadent and excessively cruel, so a lens of skepticism is always wise. We will return to this later. But for now, let us delve into the story he tells, for the details he provides are chillingly specific. The story centers on a young Persian soldier named Mithridates. During a pivotal battle, Mithridates managed to wound and inadvertently cause the death of Cyrus the Younger, the king's rebellious brother. At a celebratory banquet, a foolish, wine-fueled pride took hold of Mithridates. He boasted openly that it was he, and no other, who had slain the king's great rival. This was a fatal mistake. King Artaxerxes, who had carefully crafted a narrative of his own divine invincibility, was enraged. He had wanted the world to believe that he, and he alone, had struck down his brother. For his boast, Mithridates was initially sentenced to a relatively common death. But the king's mother, Parysatis, a woman known for her venomous cruelty, intervened. She convinced her son that a simple death was too merciful. The crime was not just treason, but an insult to the king's honor. The punishment, she argued, must fit the crime. It must be slow, humiliating, and absolute in its horror. She demanded that Mithridates die by the boats. Plutarch, through his sources, describes the sentence with a kind of dreadful awe. He writes, "For the boats is the following kind of punishment. It is to have the criminal die a lingering death." Those words barely scratched the surface of the meticulous, biological nightmare that was about to be unleashed. The name Scaphism comes from the Greek word scaph, meaning a skiff or a small boat, and its mechanism was deceptively simple, yet utterly inescapable. First, the executioners would take two narrow boats, often just hollowed-out tree trunks, designed to match the victim's body size as closely as possible. The condemned would be laid down in one of the boats, flat on their back. Then, the second boat was placed on top and bolted down, creating a crude, coffin-like container. This was not a simple confinement. It was a custom-fitted prison. The victim was trapped, unable to move, with only their head, hands, and feet protruding from specially made holes at either end of the morbid container. They were trapped, but crucially, they were not entirely sealed off from the world. Their extremities were exposed, a detail of profound and calculated cruelty. Imagine the psychological terror of that moment. The feeling of the wood pressing down, the sound of the bolts being hammered into place, the complete and total loss of autonomy. You are immobilized, helpless, entombed in a space barely larger than your own body. The world is reduced to what you can see in front of your face and the feeling of the rough wood against your skin. This device achieved several things simultaneously. It prevented escape. It rendered the victim completely vulnerable. But most importantly, it created a closed, humid, and dark environment for the main chamber of the body, an environment that would soon become a breeding ground, an incubator for the horrors to come. The parts of the body left exposed served as the gateways, the invitations for the outside world to begin its slow, inexorable invasion. With the victim secured, the next stage of the process began. And it is here that Scaphism elevates itself from mere torture into something truly diabolical. The instruments of pain were not whips or knives or fire. They were milk and honey. These were substances of life, of sweetness, of nourishment. In the ancient world, they were symbols of prosperity and even divinity, a land of milk and honey. The Persians would now weaponize these symbols, turning the very elements of life into catalysts for a slow, agonizing death. The process had two parts, internal and external. First, the internal. The victim was force-fed a nauseating mixture of milk and honey. If they refused to eat, the executioners would prick their eyes with sharp goads until, to spare themselves the pain, they would relent and consume the concoction. They were fed this mixture relentlessly, far beyond the point of satiation, until their stomach was bloated and their bowels were in turmoil. The biological effect of this is both predictable and gruesome. The combination of high sugar from the honey and lactose from the milk, forced upon a system in massive quantities, is a guaranteed recipe for violent, uncontrollable diarrhea. This was the goal. The victim's own body was being turned into a pump designed to fill the sealed container with liquid filth. Confined within the boats, they would be forced to lie in their own accumulating excrement. Then came the external application. The same mixture of milk and honey was painstakingly applied to the victim's exposed head, hands, and feet. Every inch of their face was slathered in the sticky, sweet substance poured into their ears, smeared over their eyelids, caked around their mouth and nose. Their hands and feet were likewise coated. This wasn't random. This was bait. It was a fragrant, irresistible invitation. The stage was now set. The victim was immobilized. Their body was primed to become a cesspool from within, and their exposed parts were painted with a beacon for every crawling, flying, and biting creature in the vicinity. The boat, now containing its helpless, filth-producing, and honey-slathered occupant, was then taken to a place of stagnant, fetid water, a swamp, a marsh, or the still edges of a lake. There, it was set adrift under the full, blistering heat of the sun. And then, nature was invited to the feast. The first to arrive would be the flies. Swarms of them, drawn by the dual allure of the sweet honey and the foul stench of the feces. They would descend upon the victim's face, a living, buzzing shroud. They would crawl into their nostrils, their ears, the corners of their eyes. The victim, with their hands bolted inside the container, could do nothing to wave them away. They could only endure the maddening, tickling torment. But the flies were not just there to torment. They were there to propagate. They would lay their eggs in the honey, in the filth, and in any small cut or abrasion on the skin. Soon, other insects would join them. Wasps and stinging bees, attracted to the honey, would deliver fiery stabs of pain. Mosquitoes would feast on the exposed flesh. Ants would march in columns across their face, exploring every orifice. As the days wore on under the oppressive sun, the true horror would begin to unfold inside the boat. The enclosed space, filled with excrement and sweat, warmed by the sun, became a perfect incubator. The fly eggs would hatch. Maggots, tiny and voracious, would begin to squirm within the filth. But their feeding ground was not limited to the waste. They would begin to consume the victim himself. They would burrow into his flesh, starting with the soft tissues of the anus, and growing, eating him alive from the inside out. The victim would be able to feel this. They would feel the writhing, squirming consumption of their own body. Meanwhile, on the outside, the exposed parts of the body would begin to decay. The constant insect bites, the sun, the filth, it would all lead to infection. The skin on the face, hands, and feet would become a mass of sores and weeping pustules. Gangrene would set in, the flesh turning black and necrotic, the stench of its decay adding to the already overpowering miasma. The victim would be trapped in a state of sensory overload. The maddening buzz of flies, the searing pain of stings, the unbearable itch of crawling insects, the torment of their own rotting flesh, the suffocating stench, and the relentless heat of the sun. Delirium would inevitably set in, a feverish, nightmarish state where reality and hallucination blur into one continuous stream of agony. A normal person subjected to such trauma would die relatively quickly from dehydration, shock, or exposure. But Scaphism was not designed for a quick death. Its entire philosophy was rooted in prolonging the agony for as long as humanly possible. And so, every single day, the executioners would return. They would paddle out to the floating coffin. They would check on their charge. Was he still alive? Still conscious? If so, the ritual would begin anew. They would once again force-feed him a mixture of milk and honey. This served a dual purpose. It prevented death from dehydration or starvation, keeping the victim alive to endure more suffering. And it refueled the entire gruesome process, producing fresh excrement to sustain the growing colony of vermin inside the boat. They were not just feeding the man. They were feeding the ecosystem that was consuming him. They would also reapply a fresh coat of honey to his face, hands, and feet, ensuring the irresistible lure for the insects never faded. This daily visit was perhaps the most psychologically devastating part of the entire ordeal. It was a daily reminder that this was not a random act of nature, but a deliberate, methodical, and human-engineered hell. There was no hope of rescue, no chance of a quick end. The faces of his torturers were a guarantee that the suffering would continue for another day. They were the gardeners of his decay. According to Plutarch, the ordeal of Mithridates lasted for an astonishing 17 days. For 17 days, he endured this cycle of forced feeding, filth, and consumption. When the executioners finally came and opened the top of the boat, they found his body, as Plutarch writes, with its flesh all eaten away, and swarms of these creatures preying on and, as it were, growing to his inwards. His death was not an event, but a process of complete and total biological annihilation. His body transformed from a human vessel into nothing more than a hive of putrefaction. Now we must return to that crucial question. Did this actually happen? Is the story of Scaphism a factual account of a Persian punishment, or is it a masterpiece of Greek propaganda designed to paint their enemies as monstrous barbarians? The evidence for Scaphism is undeniably thin. Our primary, detailed account comes from a single source, Plutarch. While a respected historian, he was writing centuries after the events he described, and as a Greek, he was not an impartial observer of Persian affairs. It's entirely possible the story was an embellishment, or even a complete fabrication, intended to shock his Greek audience and reinforce their sense of cultural superiority. Some historians argue that the biological practicalities make the 17-day timeline almost impossible. Sepsis, dehydration, or shock would likely have killed a man long before that, even with the daily feedings. However, the story does not exist in a vacuum. Other, later writers mention it. The 12th century Byzantine historian, Ioannis Zanaras, describes the punishment in similar terms, suggesting the story persisted for over 1,000 years. Furthermore, the Achaemenid Persians were known for their particularly brutal and inventive punishments for treason and rebellion. Impalement, flaying, and mutilation were well documented. In this context of established cruelty, Scaphism, while extreme, does not seem entirely out of character. Ultimately, we cannot be certain. The truth may lie somewhere in the middle. Perhaps there was a real punishment that involved trapping a victim with insects, which Plutarch then exaggerated for dramatic effect. Or perhaps it is simply a cautionary tale, a black legend meant to illustrate the ultimate horror. But whether fact or fiction, the story of Scaphism serves a purpose. It is a chilling exploration of the depths of human imagination when turned toward cruelty. It demonstrates a desire not just to kill an enemy, but to utterly debase and dehumanize them, to strip them of their identity and reduce them to a festering piece of meat. It weaponizes the natural processes of life and decay, turning a human being into a walking spectacle of their own decomposition. The horror of Scaphism is not just in the pain, but in the perversion. It takes life milk, honey, insects, the warmth of the sun, and twists it into an engine of death. It denies the victim the dignity of a human end, and instead sentences them to an animal one, to be reabsorbed into the food chain while still breathing. It is a punishment that makes a man a witness to his own disintegration. He is forced to feel every crawling maggot, every stinging bite, every festering sore. He is forced to smell the stench of his own rot. He is forced to watch the faces of his tormentors as they dutifully ensure his agony continues for one more day. We may never know if the soldier Mithridates truly died this way, but the legend of the boats has floated down through the centuries, a dark and persistent ghost in the annals of history. It remains a haunting testament to the fact that the most terrifying monsters are not creatures from myths or legends. They are us. And the most elaborate hells are not found in an underworld, but are the ones we meticulously build for each other, right here on Earth.